Hello, welcome. Thank you for clicking through to this video where I'm trying to explain whether a four-stroke cycle carburetor can fit a two-stroke cycle engine and whether a two-stroke cycle carburetor can fit a four-stroke cycle engine. And what I'm about to explain is how these systems work to the best of my knowledge and beliefs over the years I've been working and researching these particular types of engines. I've actually produced this video on request from a subscriber, so if you would like me to do any type of video, please do let me know and we'll see what we can do there. Okay, so let's get started. And so here we've got drawings of two carburetors. I've got the four-stroke cycle here on the left and I've got the two-stroke cycle here on the right. Now I have already got a video here on YouTube about how these carburetors differ from each other in quite detail, so I won't be going into it in that much detail, but of course I will be covering some differences here, some major differences. So to start off then, in my personal experience with four-stroke engines and two-stroke engines and four-stroke carburetors and two-stroke carburetors is that generally the two-stroke carburetors are a lot smaller than the four-stroke carburetors. It's not always the case, but generally it is. And we've got to start somewhere, so I thought we may as well start with this. So size can be an issue. And so let's take this four-stroke engine here. If we were to put this little tiny carburetor, if we could somehow mount this to this larger engine here, we could see that at the very least it would present fueling issues because this carburetor wouldn't be able to produce the amount of fuel that this large engine needed. So to start off with then, I would say that size and the fittings, so the mounting to the engine, would be an issue. So they're the two things I would say to start with. But as I've already explained, there's always exceptions and this isn't always the case in all cases. This is just generally. I'm just skipping over the basic principles. But let's imagine that size isn't an issue, and let's imagine now that we've got a two-stroke carburetor the same size as we've got the four-stroke carburetor. So we've got two carburetors here the same size. Now, even though size isn't an issue, because we've got the same size now, there are going to be some key differences within them carburetors that make them specific to four-stroke and two-stroke, particularly if the two-stroke carburetor is from engines like from garden machinery such as strimmers and hedge cutters, etc. This can be very different for other engines such as those off motorbikes and things like that, but I shall go over that very shortly. And so let's take a look at some of those differences here, and we'll start with the two-stroke carburetor. Now a significant feature here, and one of the reasons why this particular carburetor will only fit on a two-stroke engine, is this part here. It's the fuel pump. And the way that this little pump works is in conjunction with the two-stroke engine itself. It's in conjunction with its very structure and function. And so, in brief, when the piston is down, this diaphragm is up like this, and when this piston is up, the diaphragm is down. And as I've mentioned, that's why that this particular type of carburetor can only fit on a two-stroke engine, and here's why. But let's just quickly look at these two structures here. This is the inlet port, and this is where the carburetor is mounted and where the fuel comes into the engine. Now this port here is the exhaust port, and this is where the exhaust gases are pushed out of. And so to help explain what I've mentioned, we'll put the carburetor on the inlet port here, and if we take a look underneath the carburetor, we can see a pipe here. This pipe is a direct link from the crankcase of the engine right up to the bottom of the carburetor here, which actually comes up to the bottom of the fuel pump here that I showed earlier. And so to explain how this works then, let's imagine that this piston starts in this position and then it lowers, and as it lowers it creates a pressure beneath it. And so that pressure builds up all inside this crankcase area here. And as well as that pressure closing this reed valve here, which is a one-way valve stopping any pressure going back through the carburetor the wrong way, that pressure also forces itself through this pipe here, and this pipe is called the pulse line. And so let's just take a little closer look at this there. And as I've said, the pressure from the crankcase forces its way right through the pulse line and to the bottom of the diaphragm here, which forces this part of the diaphragm upwards. It's the air pressure that pushes it. But as we can see there, the piston's at its lowermost point now, so now it's going to go back up, and when it does, we've got a reversal of all of this. Instead of there being a pressure pushing through the pulse line now, because the piston's going back up, it's creating a vacuum behind it, and that means a vacuum is coming out of the pulse line as well, and that has an effect there on the diaphragm. That's sucking the diaphragm down. And of course this would be at the same time as it draws air and fuel now out of the carburetor into the crankcase here. But I have actually got a video on how these systems work in detail, so I won't go too much into how it works. And so that's another major reason why a little two-stroke carburetor like this will only work on a two-stroke engine, because two-stroke engines have crankcase compression that's very specific to that particular type of engine. A four-stroke engine doesn't actually create any pressure to this degree anyway inside the crankcase, so it's not a crankcase compression engine. And so the reason this carburetor works on a two-stroke then, again, quickly, is that it's got a pulse line which is directly connected to the crankcase, and the four-stroke engine doesn't have any pulse line here because it doesn't create any crankcase compression, and that means that there would be no movement of this diaphragm if we were to put this onto a four-stroke engine. Okay, and moving on, and another reason why this carburetor would only work on this two-stroke engine is because of this little reed valve here, which I've already mentioned. And as we already know, this valve is designed to open and close depending on whether there's a vacuum behind the piston or whether there's pressure. But let's say that the piston has just travelled upwards into the cylinder and created that vacuum behind it. What's happened there is now it's drawn in air and fuel out of the carburetor, and that reed valve is opened to allow that air and fuel to enter the crankcase. And now that the piston's travelling back down, it's creating that pressure in the crankcase again, and it's pushed that reed valve onto its seat, shutting it off, stopping any of the mixture going that way, any of that fuel and air mixture that is. And what I'm trying to get at here, and what I'm trying to explain, is that this carburetor is designed specifically to produce a specific amount of air and fuel mixture that is able to be pulled through this reed valve. So it works in conjunction with this reed valve, if you like. It produces the right amount of mixture that can be safely and effectively drawn through the spacing that this reed valve creates when it's open. And over the years I've worked on these types of engines with reed valves, it's become evident to me, and I'm sure anybody who's ever worked on these types of engines, if they've ever had any problems with these reed valves, these engines just will not run. Now, not all two-strokes have these reed valves. I'm just being general when I say this. As I've said, what I'm trying to say here is that these carburetors are designed to run in sync with these reed valves. And so that brings me on to the point that if we were to put one of these types of carburetors onto a four-stroke engine, you can see there that it's a different type of inlet for a start, and the valving system's different. Instead of it being a reed valve, we've got a poppet valve, and these different diameters, etc. And these types of carburetors aren't built to be used in conjunction with poppet valves. Basically, the airflow through and the fuel flow out of the carburetor wouldn't complement this type of system. It wasn't designed for it. And of course, in looking into what we've just looked into, we realise now that there's probably many reasons why a four-stroke carburetor wouldn't be compatible for this two-stroke engine. But what I'll do very shortly, I'll highlight the main reason I believe that a four-stroke carburetor wouldn't be compatible for this engine. As well as there being some main differences between these two carburetors, one being that the two-stroke here, as we've mentioned, has a fuel pump which draws the fuel in from the fuel tank and then pumps it round the carburetor, and that the fuel is supplied to the four-stroke here through gravity, so it's gravity fed and it fills this reservoir beneath. But in my opinion, the key differences between these two carburetors are the ways in which the jets function. And so now, of course, I'll explain why. And to do that, we'll take a different view of these carburetors from this angle of each carburetor. So as if we're looking down the inlet tube on both. And we'll make sure to put them side by side like this. There we go. And at a glance now, they look very, very similar. But as before, we've got the four-stroke on the left and the two-stroke on the right. And we can see from both here we've got the Venturi area, so this is the restriction that I'm trying to show as being these here. And so again, looking down the induction tube, this is that smaller orifice we'd see. And if we did, the one thing that we might notice here, and it's not the same in all cases, but generally it is that if we were to get these two carburetors together, we'd see that the two-stroke jet would stick out slightly from the Venturi here, and the four-stroke would stick up slightly further. And of course that means if we've got the centre of the Venturi here, then the four-stroke jet is protruding out closer to it than the two-stroke. And it's this difference that has a huge significance to each carburetor's individual function when it comes to fueling. Let's bear in mind that I'm talking about a four-stroke being something that uses neat fuel, and obviously a two-stroke that uses pre-mixed fuel. I know in some cases, some two-strokes, they don't have pre-mixed fuel going through the carburetor, but in this case what I'm talking about, let's imagine it does. And so there's a direct relationship between the type of fuel a carburetor uses and how far these jets stick out from the Venturi. When we're using neat fuel, as in with the four-stroke here, the jet tends to sit higher inside the Venturi. And when we're using fuel that's pre-mixed with two-stroke oil, as of course we see with the two-stroke carburetor, the jet tends to sit lower. Now, there are exceptions to this, of course, it's not always the case, but let's just have a look why this is. And to do that, we've got to have a quick look at the fuel itself. So, if we take the four-stroke here, if we could see its little molecules, if you like, we'd see that it's just neat fuel there. And the viscosity of this neat fuel would be somewhere in the region of 0.006 poise units. So, it would be quite thin. Poise units are a unit of measurements that viscosity is measured in, and I won't go into that in any further detail because I want to keep to the point. Judging by the spelling, you wouldn't think it would be pronounced as poise, but that's generally accepted that way. And just to give a testimony to how low the viscosity, so how thin gasoline fuel is at 0.006 poise, let's take a look at water. I've got water here, and that comes in at 0.01 poise. And so water's slightly thicker, so it gives us a good idea of how thin gasoline fuel is. And so what about pre-mixed two-stroke fuel then? Well, of course, part of the ingredients is fuel, like any other, so it's just gasoline. The difference is, of course, we've pre-mixed it with oil, two-stroke oil. So that oil is going to add to its viscosity, and it's going to be thicker than neat fuel as a result. And all I can tell you at this point is that it's going to have a greater viscosity than neat fuel. And the reason I can only say that and can't give you a figure is because there's different levels of mixing on these pre-mixed two-stroke fuels. Sometimes it's 25:1, sometimes it's 50:1. Some people even recommend really low as something like 20:1. So they're going to have differences there in viscosity. So it's best that I just say it will have a greater viscosity than neat. So let's take a look at why this is so significant then to the centre of the Venturi and to the jets. And so let's take a look at the four-stroke first. As we've said with the four-stroke, we've got the jet that sticks out a little further than the two-stroke. And so the way it functions then is that when we start the engine, when we first turn the key or pull the start pull cord, air rushes in through the Venturi, of course. And this air rushing across the jet and the vacuum pressure in there starts to draw that fuel up through the jet and out. And so the end result here is that the fuel is coming out into the Venturi there and mixing with the air at a position that's very, very close to the centre of the airflow there. And if we compare that to the two-stroke here, when we start the engine, of course, we've got the airflow coming in and that's drawing fuel up the jet now, and it's drawing it out of the jet. But because the jet's set much lower on this two-stroke here, we've got a further distance for the fuel to travel up towards the main airflow there inside the Venturi so it can mix with the air. And this is where the significant relationship between this low main jet here and the higher viscosity of the fuel comes in. Now, because this two-stroke fuel has got a higher viscosity, so it's thicker, it takes longer for it to atomize, for it to mix with the air, than does that of the neat fuel on the four-stroke. So having a lower main jet like this and having the fuel travel further up into the Venturi means that when that fuel is drawn out from that jet there, it's got more time as it's travelling towards the centre of the airflow to separate because of its thick viscosity and then atomise so it can be used in combustion. And so knowing all of that now then, we can see why the main reason that the four-stroke jet is set higher in the Venturi is because the fuel viscosity is so much thinner, so much less viscous, that it separates much easier, and so it can be brought out there into the centre of the airflow, or closer to it, because it will separate much quicker. And so remember that low jet there on the two-stroke means that thicker fuel has more time to dribble out of that main jet there and then be mixed with the air. And so that's probably one of the main reasons why we can't use a low main jet like this on the four-stroke, because we've got a lower viscosity there of fuel and it would be drawn out much quicker and atomized much sooner, and so it might result in too much fuel coming out into the Venturi. However, as I've said, there are always exceptions and it depends on the type of carburetor and how it was designed. I'm only covering the basics here because I can't possibly cover all examples. But in general, we can start to see now why we can't just put a two-stroke carburetor on a four-stroke engine and vice versa. But while we're on the differences between the two main jets of the two particular carburetors, I'll go a little step further and show you that it isn't just about how high these jets protrude out into the Venturi, it's also their position. And to show that a little better, I'll go back to the cross-sectional diagram. And so here's the Venturi restriction, and we can see we've got the main jet this side of it because the air actually travels in through this way. And so the main jet is on the inner side, slightly past the restriction of the Venturi. And the reason for that is all about how the air travels through the carburetor on the way to the engine. And so when the engine starts and air's flowing through the carburetor here, at these 2 points here, the air is travelling at the same speed. But of course, when the air comes past the restriction here, it has to go between this smaller orifice, but it's still got to have an equal amount of air passing through it per period of time as this side does and this side. And we might say that these areas here are wider and so we can fit a higher volume of air through, and that's true. And of course there's less volume of air through the restriction. And of course you'd think that less air would be able to get through this orifice. But what happens is, to compensate for not having such a wider volume surface area, if you like, the air moving through this restriction here has to speed up, so it increases in velocity to make up for the fact that it hasn't got the same surface area, so the same volume as these two areas. So in a nutshell, it's not blessed with the same volume to carry the amount of air through, but it speeds up to allow the same amount of air through. And so notice there that I've already mentioned at this point here inside the restriction, the air is moving at its fastest, so its highest velocity. And if we note the position of the main jet there in relation to it, we can see that it's just out of the main velocity airflow, so it's just out of the high speed airflow. And so at that point it's where the air starts to slow down a little more. And the reason for that is, as we've mentioned already, is the viscosity of the fuel itself. Because the four-stroke fuel is so thin, it has no problem whatsoever being drawn up the jets from the bottom here, from the float chamber, and then brought out into the inlet there, so just past that restriction in the Venturi and mixing with the air. It can do this quite easy with a lower velocity of air because the fuel viscosity is so thin. And therefore it doesn't need to be brought out directly inside the restriction where the intense velocity air is. So let's have a look now at what would happen if we put a more viscous fuel in here, so a pre-mixed two-stroke fuel, pre-mixed with oil of course. Now I have overemphasised this here to make a point, but if we were to view inside the inlet there, we'd probably see that with a higher viscosity fuel it wouldn't mix the same with the air, and it probably wouldn't mix right out and fill the inlet tube quite the same as it would with the four-stroke. And of course we know now that the reason for this is because the main jet, as well as it being a little too high and it hasn't got time for the fuel to separate, it's also to do with the airflow. The airflow where the main jet is at a lower velocity than what this highly viscous fuel needs. It needs a higher velocity of air in order to atomize it and mix with the air efficiently. Having a four-stroke engine run on a system that's fueling like this would obviously create problems with the engine running itself. It would probably coke up the spark plug and valves with carbon, and it just wouldn't run efficiently what it's meant to run like. So let's compare that then to the two-stroke carburetor with its two-stroke fuel. If we imagine now we've got this carburetor and it's all primed up with fuel, so it's ready to go. We've got the main jet here and the main jet's primed up, ready to go, let's imagine. And if we look at where the exit of the main jet is, we can see there that it's exiting actually inside that restriction. Again, different to the four-stroke main jet, which was just past the restriction. So already we can start to see some structural differences that will relate to the functional differences. And we'll see an appreciation for those differences when we add the airflow. Of course, as with the four-stroke, we've got these two areas here that are travelling at the same speed as each other, and then we've got the centre of the restriction there that has to speed up to allow that speed of airflow to continue all the way down the inlet tube. And as that main jet is terminating into the main flow there inside that restriction, that means that there's more energy there, more high velocity air to drag that thicker viscous fuel out of there, out of that main jet, and as it does, it hits it hard, making it separate and atomizing it and making it mix with that air efficiently. And so we can see now that that fuel's nicely separated and it's expanding out through the whole width of the induction tube there, and it's heading off in towards the engine where it will be combusted properly. And I know we've kind of covered this already, but if we were to allow neat fuel to come out of this main jet at this point here in the centre of this restriction, then there'd be so much velocity there it would really drag out on that low viscosity fuel, and it would probably drag too much of it out there because it's designed to drag a thicker viscosity as we've gone through. So it will probably drag too much fuel out of there and there'd be too much fuel going into the engine. And if this was running on a two-stroke engine anyway, on this type of two-stroke that requires this type of carburetor, it would seize the engine anyway. And so now we can see some key differences between the four-stroke carburetor and the two-stroke carburetor and why we can't interchange the fuels with them. Remember, I've only used an example here of the type of two-stroke that requires a pre-mix with oil. And so in certain cases, like with certain motorbikes that don't require a fuel that's pre-mixed with oil because it can be injected in after, then things can be quite different because this neat fuel going through the carburetor before the injection of the oil. And so the fueling system would be more like what we see in the four-stroke. In instances where the actual carburetor body between the four-stroke and the two-stroke are identical, then it's the system, the jetting system, that's the difference. And we've gone through some of the differences, but there are some carb bodies out there that are identical and the jetting systems are the differences between them. And I have heard of cases where some people have rejetted, let's say, a two-stroke in order to be used on a four-stroke and vice versa. And whilst I've heard of successes and mishaps, it's important to remember that it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of energy and probably a lot of expense to rejet these carburetors and then get them to run just right at the end once everything's been rejetted. Some people would say it was probably too much mither than it's worth. Because do remember that each carburetor is specifically made for a certain type of engine, and to get them running just so isn't always an easy task. Even if we've got the right carburetor for the right engine, we still have to play about with these things to get them working just right. So my advice would be to look in at the expense of buying a new carburetor for the actual machine that you have. So just look up the correct carburetor and look into buying that. That will save you a lot of time and probably heartache in the end. And so I hope I've managed to explain my point there. As I've said, I couldn't cover every detail here. I've had to scratch the surface. I know there's far more detail than what I've said here, and that there's going to be people out there with a greater knowledge than me. I realise that. But I could only cover the very basics here, and I've got many more videos to put on. If you do want me to do another video on something else, please let me know and I will look into doing so. Other than that, if this was of value to you, this video, then please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. Thank you for watching.